noticed they were all using very similar pathways through the landscape, all using the same parts of Eastern Australia. And if you can cast your mind back to that first image that I showed you of the pathways or the connections at a landscape scale across Eastern Australia, there is a very obvious alignment between where those connections exist and where birds are moving through the landscape, highlighting pronounced movement pathways, pronounced movement holes in the landscape, places in the parts of the landscape that they're not moving through, and also highlighting that some of those landscapes that they're moving through are actually quite clearly defined narrow areas of the landscape. Sometimes naturally defined, it might be a narrow range that's moving, providing for movement through a part of the landscape and still forested. In other parts of the landscape, it might be because they are the areas adjacent have actually been significantly developed. So in thinking about also how species are potentially going to be using those pathways and using movement as a strategy to adapt, there's been a lot of work over the last 3 years in particular under what's called our Natural Resource Management Climate Adaptation Program. This is work that's actually been funded by the Australian government and has been done on a catchment scale basis, so looking at the major catchments of the continent. In this case, we're just going to zoom in on a particular cluster of catchments across New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, but also across into South Australia, a landscape that's referred to as the MurrayDarling Basin, which is the main eastern watershed of Eastern Australia. Now, what this particular model actually did was looked at identifying the landscapes and the areas of the landscape that are going to be most important for enabling species to adapt to change, whether it's change in human disturbance or changes in climate patterns, for example, warming and drying events that are becoming increasingly regular in Eastern Australia. And what it did was it actually analysed the data and looked at the biodiversity metrics to identify whereabouts in the landscape is there likely to be the greatest potential for us to retain that diversity at a local scale in response and in the light of the changing climate patterns around. The brown areas are areas of the continent that are most important for investment, and the blue areas are less important. There's a whole story behind what are the factors that are driving that. But really what it highlights in this particular image is the importance of the eastern ranges right the way across Eastern Australia, particularly down in Victoria and southern New South Wales, and those areas that are going to be important in securing the diversity and the endemism of species up around that north coast of New South Wales and southeast Queensland. Apologies for that, somebody just decided to call me. Secondly, we also looked at importance for connectivity, or the importance of our natural connections in supporting adaptation to climate change into the future. The darker the blue, the better, or the more important for adaptation. And this really highlighted again the importance of Eastern Australia and the eastern ranges for supporting species adaptation using movement strategies. So thinking about species like I was just showing you with the bird migration patterns, highlighting the importance of the eastern ranges for that kind of adaptation strategy. Okay, so what does the future hold? Back in 2010-11, we also started to do a lot of work thinking about the importance of Eastern Australia in terms of maintaining condition. So this particular model actually highlights the importance of landscapes for their condition itself, just in the eastern section of New South Wales, and we've got there highlighted the Eastern Ranges corridor itself, the area outlined by blue. In 2010, as I say, what we did was we actually set out to find out where are the areas of the landscape that are still in pretty good condition and that are likely to maintain that condition into the future. The areas that are highlighted in green, basically the darker the green, the better the condition. What this map actually, or this model actually highlighted to us was not just what we already realized, which was the importance of our existing protected areas network for maintaining areas which are currently in good condition. If I was to overlay onto that particular model a map of where our existing protected areas occur, the areas that are shown in dark are largely areas that are covered by our existing reserve network. But a number of the areas adjoining them and forming those linkages to the east and the west also are important as being in still pretty good condition. Now, this particular modelling that we did relies quite strongly on a number of assumptions around things like land use, distance from infrastructure, the potential for invasion by invasive animals, but also the current predominance of introduced weed species. And what the model allows us to do is to make projections into the future to understand, okay, so what does the landscape look like, say, in 20 years' time if we do nothing to address those current pressures that are operating in the landscape? What happens if we don't address the issues that are currently causing a lot of that landscape of eastern New South Wales, in this case, to not be in good condition? So the model allowed us to actually project forward, and I'm going to show you in a moment a projection looking forward 20 years. And what it actually highlights is, I'm just going to toggle down to it now. Looking forward in 20 years, if we factor in things like land use pressures, I talked about earlier the impacts of the potential growth in urban populations and in human communities along eastern Australia, but also impacts from things like weeds and infrastructure that come along with increased population. And what we see is the potential for the contraction of landscapes and areas that are in good condition to be really limited back into the core of our protected areas system. I'm just going to toggle back and forward between that because it's quite a stark impression. So that's the current condition of landscapes in eastern Australia, and that's looking forward 20 years. And really what it highlights is that landscapes that currently, for example, in the centre of the range is their area centred around to the west of Sydney, a landscape known as the Greater Blue Mountains. What's currently quite a large, intact, well-connected landscape at the moment, projecting forward with infrastructure impacts and the like, has the potential to see quite significant islanding and fragmentation of our reserve network. We're factoring in increasingly the impacts of the warming and drying events that we've witnessed over the last few years. I mentioned to Adrian earlier that we're heading up towards 30 degrees today here where I am, and on the south coast of New South Wales at a time of year where normally we'd be sitting around the low 20s. So we're seeing some really quite pronounced warming events happening at the moment. And the impacts of that on landscapes in particularly the fringe parts of the eastern ranges are really quite pronounced. So this is some work that that was done quite recently, aligned with the earlier climate adaptation modelling that I was showing you, which highlights what the impacts of warming and drying events are on the natural connections of eastern Australia. Now, you wouldn't be aware of the geography, but the image or the map that's on the left-hand side there, the one that's the Spatial Analysis 2015, that's actually focusing on a landscape immediately to the west of Sydney, probably about 75 kilometres to the west of Sydney. On the western fringe of the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area, and the big blob that's there at green is what's known as the Abercrombie River National Park. Now, I guess what I really want to impress on you with this particular model is the strength of the connections and the complexity of the connections between that reserve, the surrounding landscape, and back up into the Blue Mountains reserve system as it stands at the moment. So green areas are really strong. Large landscape connections, continental scale connections. The purple areas are local scale connections. We project forward 2050 with some of the models that we have, and what obviously highlight there is the way that a lot of those connections start to really break down, largely through a simplification of the floristic structure and composition of the habitats, but also the potential for species to be able to move, but also factoring in a number of those other land use impacts such as infrastructure, and also the continued impacts of weeds in invasive feral animals like foxes, deer and goats through that landscape. So really, I guess that, in a nutshell, is what Greyton Ranges is all about. It's about securing the natural values of the landscape, helping to maintain its functions into the future, and also working across landscapes to try and provide some resilience against the impact changes that we're projecting into the future. So it really is a truly large landscape agenda, looking towards linking up reserves across that landscape. I'll talk a little bit now over the next 10 minutes about how it is that we're actually doing that. So trying to achieve connectivity across 3,600 kilometres in any landscape is going to be quite a substantial proposition. What we're doing is we're attempting to do that by biting off manageable chunks and working in the most important connections. We've done a lot of work to identify whereabouts in the landscape we should be focusing, understanding what are the specific impacts in those landscapes, and really working most importantly with local communities to find landscapes where we have willing communities or communities that are amenable to doing the kinds of work that is needed to achieve large landscape conservation. So we're currently working in 10 landscapes. They're all highlighted there on that map, so working from the top down. So the most northerly of the landscapes that we actually have a collaborative partnership effort happening is the hinterland bush links around the Sunshine Coast. That's that really mauvey khaki brown in the north, there in just in southeast Queensland. Then there's that funny shaped, a bit like a H-shaped landscape down on the border between southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales. That's called the Border Ranges. That's a particularly important landscape. That's actually the main centre for the Gondwana rainforest of Eastern Australia, which is one of the 3 World Heritage listed areas that I was talking about earlier. If we move south of there, we have a landscape in blue, which is known as the Jalegia Biodiversity Alliance area, centred around the major northern town of Coffs Harbour. That also has reserves within it, particularly up on the escarpment, that are part of the Gondwana rainforests of Eastern Australia World Heritage properties. But it's a natural altitudinal connection that links the cool subtropical rainforests up on the tops of the plateau down to the coasts around the town of Coffs Harbour. Moving south, we have a grey blue landscape, a large landscape known as the Hunter Valley. That's actually, it has 2 features about it which make it particularly, well, 3 features about it that make it particularly interesting. The first is that it's actually a natural contraction and lowering of the ranges. It's one of the few places in Eastern Australia where the range actually contracts down to a height of only a couple of 100 metres above sea level, but it also contracts down in terms of its width to being only about 2 kilometres wide. So it's a natural pinch point in the Eastern Ranges. What that's allowed has actually been also quite unique in an Eastern Australian experience. The Great Dividing Range actually performs a natural barrier isolating the inland biota from the coastal biota. So we don't see a lot of movement of particularly plant species between the drier and semi-arid interior of Australia and the coastal, temperate and humid coastal environments. In the Hunter Valley, we actually see a merging of those 2 sets of diversity. So particularly important in terms of its connections, north and south, but also its diversity in terms of the emergence of the inland and the coastal biota. And the third feature that makes it interesting is it's also a really interesting convergence of land use conflicts. It's one of the main landscapes traditionally for coal production, so a large part of that landscape is actually earmarked for coal development. If any of you have ever flown over there, it's really quite pronounced in terms of the impact that coal has on the landscape. It's our main wine growing district for Eastern Australia, along with the Barossa Valley down in South Australia and areas over in Western Australia. So it's one of our main wine growing landscapes, and also the main area of that main landscape for thoroughbred horse breeding. It's the 2nd largest thoroughbred horse breeding landscape outside of Kentucky, which is centered around Scone in the upper Hunter Valley. So a really interesting landscape. Then we move south. The little orangey projection out to the west, out the back of the Blue Mountains, is called the Canangra-Boyd to Wangler link. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. That's a landscape that provides a natural landscape corridor between the ranges and what's known as the Western Woodlands Way, which is a natural pathway for migratory species through the drier, semi-arid interior of New South Wales and southern Queensland. It's connected to the Southern Highlands, a little bit there to the east of it, which is a slightly purplish landscape, which is one of the oldest settled inland districts or landscapes of New South Wales, indeed of Australia, and is really an important landscape in linking the main reserves of the Greater Blue Mountains with landscapes to the south. Then the real purple area down there on the coast is known as the Illawarra Shoalhaven landscape, which forms a whole series of natural altitudinal connections between coastal reserves and the ranges. It's also the main centre for our temperate rainforests in eastern Australia. Centred around the Australian Capital Territory in Canberra, we have what's called Kosciuszko Coast, which is the longest standing partnership that's been involved in Great Eastern Ranges, formed around 2007, providing connections between the alpine landscapes of the Australian Capital Territory and the south coast. Over on the west, we have another landscape which forms the slopes to summit landscape, connecting the alpine hard country with the semi-arid interior. And then down in Victoria, a major landscape known as the Central Victorian Biolinks, which is actually 6 large landscape connections which are connecting the Grampians, which are the eastern, or the Grampian Range, which is the western extreme of the Great Dividing Range, right the way along the eastern escarpment to the main range, linking the central parts of Victoria up with the southwestern parts of the Australian alpine country. In 2011, we commissioned a report which looked at the importance of connectivity in the landscape, but also, more importantly, did a review of the literature. And I believe Adrian's got access to this report and will be circulating it to you after the session today. Really, this document, what it provides is the blueprint for connectivity conservation and large landscape conservation principles in Eastern Australia. There's not been a lot of work in Australia thinking about large landscape connectivity. A lot of the Australian connectivity work going back into the mid-1980s has really been focused on local scale connections and the importance of, for example, roadsides in rural landscapes for connecting up otherwise fragmented habitats. What the Great Eastern Ranges commissioned back in 2010 was a report from Professor Brendan Mackey, who used to be with the Australian National University, now the director of the Climate Change Centre with Griffith University in Queensland, along with people like Graham Warboys, the Vice Chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, and in particularly one of the leading specialists in connectivity conservation globally. And also a chap called Ed Watson, who was one of the people involved in the Slopes to Summit partnership from the outset. The report that we commissioned did a review of global literature and applied the principles of connectivity conservation and large landscape conservation globally to the Eastern Australian context, and really highlighted the importance of not only enabling seasonal and adaptation movements across Eastern Australia, but also the importance of our getting serious about our invasive species problems, applying the full range of conservation tools, and really bringing together consortiums at a landscape scale to be able to work in landscapes such as the 10 areas that we're working in, to be able to work together and address the impacts at a local scale. In 2013, we saw the publication of what's known as the National Wildlife Corridors Plan, largely driven by the report by Brendan Mackey and others. And it highlighted the existence and the importance of not just the Great Eastern Ranges initiative, but also a number of other large landscape corridors on an Australian scale. So we've actually seen an explosion in the number of large landscape connectivity initiatives in Australia in recent times. So Great Eastern Range Initiative is just one of those initiatives that's currently operating to try and achieve the kinds of outcomes that I've been talking about. The Great Eastern Range Initiative formed in 2007, as I said at the outset. It's gone through several phases of development. We've had 2 periods of investment by the New South Wales government. So most of the investment that's happened today in terms of the core enterprise has been driven by New South Wales, but there have been a number of large projects that have been funded by the Australian government. So in 2007, we saw a 3-year process to actually establish a series of partnerships. It was established, as I say, as part of the New South Wales government program, but in 2010 it was evolved into being a multi-partner public-private partnership involving New South Wales government and 4 national non-government organisations. In 2012, we went into a period of quite considerable growth and expansion. Since 2007, we've actually grown to not just having 10 regional partnerships, but involving about 270 organisations in those regional partnerships. And also 22 state and national organisations, including state government organisations like the Parks Service for Victoria and New South Wales, but also our private conservation trusts like the Queensland Trust for Nature. From the outset, Great Eastern Ranges has had a strong emphasis on, obviously, movement, but I would like to highlight the fact that we do have as much of an interest in the species that are sedentary, that don't move beyond the landscapes that they are living out their entire life cycle within. So we're as interested in local species as we are in long-distance movements. And we're also interested in reflecting the types of movement that we need to support through a range of different corridor strategies. So in enabling movement, we're as interested in allowing for large landscape connections, so where we have large physical intact landscapes and maintaining those landscapes as intact. We're as interested in that as we are in other landscapes where we may have had fragmentation and we need to simply maintain stepping stone connections. And also having local connections and riparian connections at a local scale. So we're interested in supporting a range of movement strategies. With over 270 organisations involved, a large part of what Great Eastern Range is about is actually bringing those organisations together and having them consolidate their efforts in a particular landscape, focus on some common areas and priorities for effort, and invest our effort collectively so that we get a much better combined outcome. So what that actually involves in terms of our day-to-day business, we're very much involved in the business of raising public awareness about the importance of the ranges, but also the impacts that the wildlife and the natural values of those landscapes are currently facing. Feral animals are a major problem in the Australian context. Australians are generally aware of the impacts of foxes and cats in terms of predation. They're less aware of, for example, the impacts of feral deer, which are a major problem, and in particular feral goats and pigs, which are a major problem across most of our landscapes in eastern Australia. What people are generally less aware of as well is the impacts of things like roads and fences on species movements. We have large incidences of native animal strikes on roads, so that's something that's a little bit more in your face for the average Australian. But things like fences and the impacts that they can have on some of our species, in this case there's a little image there of what's known as a sugar glider, which is a native possum, which has a membrane which allows it to actually glide, similar to flying squirrels in North America. It's I guess it's our native marsupial equivalent to North American flying squirrels. We do have a major problem in some landscapes where barbed wire fences provide a major barrier to them moving through the landscape because they get caught up on those fences. So we do a lot of work. We've got a website that tries to bring together a lot of the information, greateasternranges.org.au, and we use it as the main platform for trying to communicate the work that we're involved in. Increasingly, we're involved in youth outreach activities, so teaching kids, school kids, with partners like Taronga Zoo in Sydney about native species and the importance of the Great Eastern Ranges for securing their conservation into the future. And also working with communities to plan efforts across the landscape, and working with landholders to likewise link up their efforts across landscapes. So we do a lot of work with private landholders, actually getting them to make private land commitments to link up their efforts across properties. Australia has a large number of organisations that are involved in delivering private land conservation programs, helping landholders to secure biodiversity by putting term-based agreements, whether it be 5 years, 10 years, through to in perpetuity agreements on their property to manage those properties for their conservation values. What we do is we provide a platform to allow those providers to be able to promote their instruments and also have landholders make some form of commitment that allows them to link up their efforts across landscapes. So this is really one example of how Great Eastern Ranges actually manifests on the ground. What we're encouraging is people to link up their efforts as what we call corridors of commitment or corridors of effort. Down in our Slopes to Summit landscape, we have one really nice example, and we have multiple examples of this in all of our landscapes. Where we have down that main image there, aerial image, we have what's known as Womargama National Park down in the bottom right-hand corner, down in the southeast. A major national park which is currently disconnected from other reserves to the west. If you look at that map to the north, we've got a property called Benambra Nature Reserve, which is separated from Womargama National Park by about 30 kilometres of agricultural land. And what we're doing in that landscape is we're working with organisations like the Nature Conservation Trust, the Murray Catchment Management Authority, the New South Wales Roads and Traffic Authority, which is now called Roads and Maritime Services, and also the managers of what's known as a travelling stock reserve along the freeway, actually getting those organisations to link up their efforts so that we are creating physical connections, tenure-based connections across the landscape that provide the basis for allowing a physical movement corridor through that landscape. And just briefly, conscious of time, I want to leave some time for you to ask questions. As I said earlier in the presentation, within Australia there is not much of an emphasis or an understanding in the broader community of the importance of migration, or just how important the Australian migration story is on a global scale. Likewise, there isn't understanding of the importance of movement at a local scale. But we are increasingly seeing some of the things that we see in places like Europe and North America, where we have crossing structures across roads becoming increasingly prevalent in Australia. So a lot of what we're doing in places like Slopes to Summit and some other landscapes in the south, where we have major infrastructure developments, is working with those infrastructure providers to actually start and plan and also demonstrate the importance of and the use of crossing structures for things like possums or gliders to be able to move across freeways, but also putting in habitat enhancement measures like nest boxes and doing feed species plantings. And finally, I've mentioned a number of times the importance of feral animal control and the impacts of invasive species on the Australian context. There are a number of threats that we need to manage whenever I talk about connectivity, conservation and Great Eastern Ranges in our rural communities. The first three questions I know I'm always going to get are going to be in relation to how we should manage the potential for movement corridors to support increased movement of feral animals like cats and goats, but also the movement of weeds and the potential impacts of things like introduced bees and wasps on some of our habitat enhancement measures like nest boxes. I also get a lot of questions about the impacts of fire in Eastern Australia and what we should be doing about that. From the outset, Great Eastern Range Initiative has had a strong emphasis on embedding feral animal, weed and fire management practices into our planning so that we're actually addressing impacts on nature and livelihoods at the same time as we're impacting, looking towards avoiding the potential for those types of processes to impact adversely upon the wider landscape. So how that manifests, just briefly, is in places like the Canangra-Boyd-Toowoomba link. This is a natural landscape that I mentioned earlier, which connects the inland of Australia with the main range and the forests. I was out in that landscape just yesterday. It's a landscape that we've only been working in since 2012, and already we've been able to achieve around about 60,000 hectares worth of feral animal control, 500 hectares worth of revegetation of priority landscape connections. And in the last year alone, we've been working with local groups. We've delivered 34 capacity building events, training workshops, training up close to a fifth of the population of that landscape in habitat management and conservation practices. There's a huge story to be told in relation to one landscape, but I'm conscious that we've got about 10 minutes left and I did want to leave some time for questions. So if I may, I'll hand back over to you, Adrienne, to field the questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gary. That was an excellent presentation. We can now move to the questions. We have a few. Hopefully we'll get through them. If we don't get through them all, what I can do is post the questions and send them out to you, Gary, to answer, and then get those questions and answers sent to the attendees. So the first one is, what motivated the government to take the lead in creating the initiative?
It's a happy coincidence of influential people with a grand idea. Those influential people were Ian Pulsford and Graham Warboys. And the happy convergence with a New South Wales State Environment Minister called Bob Davis, who was quite visionary, understood the importance of large landscape conservation, and in particular understood the importance of protected areas. Bob Davis was the former state member for the Blue Mountains, had been for a number of years. His time during his tenure as the local MP for the Blue Mountains involved he witnessed a real expansion in the growth of the parks of the Blue Mountains and surrounding landscapes, and was then in a position to actually establish a whole new series of reserves on the south, particularly the south coast of New South Wales, that actually linked up the Blue Mountains with Victoria, along an almost contiguous chain of reserves. So he understood the importance of connectivity conservation, and he also was in a position to be able to put in place a funding structure. So in 2007 he announced $7 million in New South Wales state government funding to establish the Great Eastern Range Initiative, and worked quite closely with his counterparts in the other states to establish a interstate dialogue, which resulted in the commissioning of the report by Brendan Mackey and others, which was the real blueprint of connectivity conservation in Eastern Australia. So I'd say, in a nutshell, it's that happy convergence of people with a grand idea and a state minister who understood the issues and was willing to take it on. I've got to say, one of the things that Great Eastern Ranges have been particularly successful in is being apolitical. So we've actually seen bipartisan support in New South Wales for the initiative. So Bob Davis was a New South Wales Labor minister. When he set up the initiative in 2007, the subsequent government which is a Conservative government under the New South Wales Liberal Party, actually had as its election commitment in 2010 a commitment to continue the support for Great Eastern Ranges. And so the new incoming minister, who has since moved on, a gentleman called Rob Stokes, he also came in and brought with him a strong commitment. He announced a second phase of funding for the Great Eastern Ranges. So happy coincidence in the first instance, people with vision, and then that's flowed on to a strong commitment of subsequent governments.
Excellent. The next question is, you sort of touched on it briefly, is where does your funding come from and how financially invested are the federal and provincial governments?
We've had so far $11 million in core funding from the New South Wales government. The current government just recently announced last year another $8 million for grant-based projects, so a slightly different investment model within New South Wales. We've seen in the order of about $15 million of investment in projects from the Australian government. So we're looking at the high 20s, close to $30 million in investment plus from state and national governments. Not much investment directly from the Victorian and Queensland governments as yet, but across all of the states and the jurisdictions that are involved, we've seen quite substantial co-investment and alignment of private investment. So we've seen in the order of probably 4 times as much investment from partner organisations and private enterprises as we have from state and national governments.
Well, that's quite a bit of funding. That's great. The next question is, how much of the high priority areas for connectivity are actually protected?
Currently in New South Wales, about 40% of the landscape that we're working in is within a public reserve system. There's about another 3% which is in private reserves, so they would be under private conservation covenants. And another 20% is other types of public land, so Crown reserves. In Queensland, it's close to 20%, which is in public reserve system, and about 1% which is private reserves. Victoria, it's closer to 60%, which is public reserves, and 40% which is predominantly private land.
The next question is, have land trusts in Australia started to target areas for conservation using your climate change modelling?
Not so much the modelling per se, but certainly aligning with the Great Eastern Ranges. So the Queensland Trust for Nature, for example, has embedded within its business plan and its conservation strategy a major emphasis on the Eastern Ranges. And in Victoria, the Victorian Trust for Nature, likewise, well, we've actually adopted their strategy in Victoria and their priorities. So I'd say that it's probably in Victoria been more of a case of us adopting the private trust's priorities rather than vice versa.
Great, and we actually have one more question, so we might as well ask it. It's now 3 o'clock Pacific time, 4 Mountain time, but I thought we could just squeak this last one in. What does your governance structure look like?
We're actually in a period of transition at the moment. So our governance exists at 2 levels. At the whole of Great Eastern Ranges level, since 2010, we've had a board formed by what's called the lead partners, the 5 organisations who I mentioned earlier, who were involved in setting up the central or the broader enterprise back in 2010, taking it on as a collaboration, a public-private partnership from government. They formed what's known as the Lead Partners Group. And at a regional level, each of our 10 regional partnerships has some form of working group. Now, each of our regional partnerships has a slightly different structure depending on the history and the makeup of the group. So 5 of our regional partnerships have incorporated entities, so they've established as independent entities in and of themselves, so formed mini regional NGOs. purely for the purpose of fundraising for and supporting and providing secretariat support to the collaboration of organisations operating in that landscape. The other 5 partnerships have different types of governance, ranging from a loose alliance structure with partners subscribing to principles of collaboration and basically a simple members charter, through to consortia who have come together and are bound together by a memorandum of understanding around their project funding. Now, I mentioned that we're undergoing a period of change at the moment. That's at the whole of GER level. So our current lead partners group is actually in the process of establishing or moving towards establishing a new enterprise, which would be able to operate on behalf of the partners. So up until now, Great Eastern Ranges has basically been a collaboration or a partnership of organisations. Into the future, we are going to see potentially the emergence of an organisation that is able to provide fundraising support for the collaboration as a whole, rather than having funding going directly into projects and partnerships.
Great. So that's the end of the question period. I just would like to thank you, Gary, for joining our webinar all the way from Australia. We greatly appreciate it. And
My pleasure.
thank you all the KCP partners for participating as well. Did you have anything you'd like to add, Gary?
Just thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk to you today. I've been taking a look at the work that you guys are doing online. It's really inspirational stuff, and you give us another example of what's happening out there in the wider large landscape conservation space that really does inspire what's happening in Australia. Stories about projects like Kootenay Conservation Initiative are really what help to inspire people on the ground to understand that these sorts of initiatives are doable and other people are making great achievements elsewhere, so it gives us added impetus to press on locally.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. The webinar has been recorded and will be posted on our website if you'd like to go back and look at the presentation again. Thanks again for joining us in our winter webinar series. Take care. Hi, Gary.
Yep, so we all closed up?
Yeah, people signed off, and yeah, so thank you so much. That was excellent. That was a great presentation.
Excellent. No, I hope it came across well, and I had a couple of distractions. I hadn't realised with being at home, whenever anybody rings through on the phone, because I'm using Apple-based systems, for some reason it was starting to come through on my phone as well.
Oh, that's yeah. You know what? You handled it really well. It was barely interfering with what you were doing, so it was good. I mean, those kinds of things are bound to happen, unfortunately.
Okay.
But yeah, you did great.
Okay.
I thought it looked really good, and yeah, you're an excellent speaker.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it was fun. It was fun. It's always different. I've never done an online presentation before, so yeah, this was something of a first for me. I'm usually used to walking around the room and engaging with people in an audience. So
right.
It's a different experience. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're so glad you could join us. Really interesting information, and I mean, you've done such great work. And it's amazing how big your program is. We're quite small compared to what you're doing, but
oh, look, we've got a big enterprise, but really it's all about doing stuff at the local scale. So
right.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks again, and we'll be in touch.
Excellent. Okay.
Take care.
Catch you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.